The candles have burned low. Alcobasa Monastery, January 1361. Stone corridors draped in black silk. The air carries beeswax and cold granite. Portugal's entire court has assembled. Noblemen in formal dress. Bishops. Lords from every corner of the kingdom. At the front of the hall, on the throne, sits the queen. She does not move. She has not moved in 6 years. One by one, the lords of Portugal approach. One by one, they bow. One by one, they take her hand and kiss it. The hand is cold. It has been cold since 1355. The woman on that throne was murdered 6 years ago. The king who loved her had her buried in secret. And then he waited. He waited until he had the power to do something that no one in the history of Portugal had ever done. He brought her back. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a love story. Or rather, it is the most brutal kind. The kind that does not end at death. The kind that transforms grief into legislation, and legislation into ceremony, and ceremony into something the 14th century had no precedent for. This is the story of what one man built when the kingdom took what he loved, what he dismantled, what he refused to let go of. History calls him Pedro the Cruel. His subjects called him Pedro the Just. Both were right. Before we walk back into the court of 14th century Portugal, drop a comment below with your city and your country. It tells us where our audience is. Hit subscribe. New dark history documentary every week. You are watching Velours Spectre, the Iberian Peninsula, 1325. Portugal is 40 years into its identity as a unified monarchy and already fracturing along its nobility lines. Inês de Castro arrived at the Portuguese court not as a queen, but as a lady-in-waiting, a Galician noblewoman attached to Constança Manuel, the Castilian princess brought to Coimbra to marry Crown Prince Pedro, the king's only surviving heir. The court she entered was a machine built on land grants, blood ties, and carefully managed obligation. King Afonso Thorfa, 63 years old, cautious, precise, had spent 30 years managing the balance between Portuguese autonomy and Castilian pressure. The Castro family was one of the largest noble dynasties in Iberia. They held land in Castile. They held influence in Galicia. They held connections to foreign thrones that Afonso Thorpe had spent his entire reign trying to contain. According to A.H. de Oliveira Marquez's History of Portugal, the 14th century Iberian court functioned less like a royal household and more like a sovereign corporate structure. Every alliance entered into a ledger of obligations and returns. A Galician noblewoman with Castro blood was not simply a companion. She was a political liability. The king understood this. His advisors understood it. What neither of them had accounted for was Pedro. Pedro was 22 years old when Constança arrived in Coimbra. By every law of his position, by every rule of court protocol, he was required to proceed with the marriage, execute the succession, and file whatever private preferences he held away in permanent silence. Every precedent in the royal record pointed to the same outcome. The mechanism had a variable it could not process. Inês de Castro was, by every account that survives her, a woman who made the people around her want to protect her without knowing exactly why. Fernão Lopes, writing in the 14th century, records the court's consensus. She was the most admired woman in the kingdom, not only for her appearance, which contemporaries praised without restraint, but for a quality the chronicles struggled to name precisely. She was kind, not performed kindness, not the political warmth of a woman managing alliances. She loved Pedro's children by Constança with a patience that the court watched and could not dismiss. She was Galician by birth, the illegitimate daughter of Pedro Fernandes de Castro, one of the most powerful lords in Iberia. 23 years old when she arrived at the Portuguese court in 1340. Fluent in 3 languages, possessed of the settled confidence of a woman who had grown up in a house where illegitimacy was simply one more condition to be managed, not a wound to be hidden. She did not pursue Pedro's attention. She was simply there, and Pedro, who had been told since birth exactly what his obligations were, to the crown, to Castile, to the succession, found in Inês something the official record had no category for a relationship he had chosen himself. When Constanza died in childbirth in 1345, Pedro did not wait for court approval. He brought Inês openly to his palace at Coimbra. 4 children followed over the next decade. He began calling her his wife, privately, then less privately. He may have formalized it. A secret marriage is a rumor until someone with power decides to confirm it. No one confirmed it yet. By 1354, the court's tolerance had reached its operational limit. 4 children between Pedro and Inês, all carrying Castro blood and proximity to the royal succession that Afonso Thorpe could no longer manage by polite distance. A prince who had refused every suggested remarriage for 9 years, and a Castro presence in the palace that had moved well past what any diplomatic arrangement could quietly absorb. King Afonso Thorpe convened his council. 3 men stepped into the foreground of what followed: Álvaro Gonçalves, Diogo Lopes Pacheco, and Pero Coelho, senior advisors, loyal administrators, men whose function was to protect the machinery of the succession. They presented the king with a proposal. The proposal had one name in it. Afonso hesitated for months. He authorized it. January 7, 1355. Inês de Castro was summoned to appear before the king at Coimbra. She came. The Crónica de Pedro. He records that she knelt before Afonso IV and spoke, that she brought her children into the audience chamber and placed them between herself and the king in a wordless appeal. She was asking a grandfather to see her children as his grandchildren, rather than as a liability on his succession ledger. It was her only leverage. Afonso left Coimbra without issuing an order. His counselors did not wait for him to return. The 3 men rode north to the Quinta das Lágrimas, the House of Tears, a private estate on the outskirts of Coimbra where Inês lived with Pedro's children. Pedro was in Santarém, 130 kilometers to the south. The assassins arrived before noon. Inês did not know they were coming. The Quinta das Lágrimas, January 1355. Inês de Castro stands in the garden, the specific garden that Portuguese tradition will later name the Fountain of Tears, separated from Pedro by court order, waiting. Picture this scene: a manor house set against the river Mondego. January light flat on the water. 3 men entering the estate without announcement. The Crónica de Pedro I names all 3 assassins. It does not describe what followed in mechanical terms. It describes instead the silence afterward, the operational silence of an act that has been authorized, executed, and considered closed. Inês de Castro was killed in that garden. She was 35 years old. She had lived in Portugal for 15 years. She had borne Pedro 4 children. She had never held a title, never appeared in a royal registry, never been given official existence within the system that ordered her death. She was invisible to the record. The children were in the house. They were not harmed. They were not taken anywhere safe. That evening, a courier rode south toward Santarém. Pedro received a military dispatch. The administrative language of a problem resolved, a liability removed from the court's ledger, a single communication in the dry protocol of Crown business. He did not respond. He was already moving. Within 48 hours, Pedro had gathered his forces and was marching north. His men later reported that he said almost nothing during the march, only rotes, only pace, only which fortified cities lay between him and his father's seat. The civil war began in February 1355. It lasted 24 months. Pedro's campaign moved through northern Portugal with the structure of something that had been planned long before the first battle. Not the strategy, the patience, the willingness to advance methodically city by city, without outrunning the supply lines of his own grief. He took 4 major fortified towns. He burned the administrative infrastructure at Braga. He received surrenders from men who had been signing royal decrees 3 weeks earlier. King Afonso IV was 66 years old. He did not have a military answer. He had a political one. He offered negotiation. He offered territory. He offered the one asset a reigning king possesses that most men will accept in exchange for a cessation: the appearance of victory, without the actual cost of pursuing it. The Treaty of Canaveses was concluded in 1355. Father and son met on a bridge over the Lima River. Pedro agreed to acknowledge the legality of the court's decision to accept on paper that what had happened was within the crown's authority. He agreed not to pursue the 3 assassins while his father lived. He agreed to return to his role as heir. In exchange, Afonso IV agreed to never speak of Inês de Castro in a text and contexts again. Pedro agreed to all of it. He was 35 years old. He had the patience of a man who understood exactly what the phrase "while my father lived" meant as a timeline. Afonso IV died on May 28, 1357. He had ruled Portugal for 34 years, natural causes. In his bed, Pedro Confrite. It was crowned in Coimbra. He was 37 years old. His first years as king were productive. Trade reform, a reorganization of the royal court's legal apparatus that modern historians describe as one of the most efficient administrative overhauls in 14th century Iberia. He heard cases personally. He issued judgments without delay. He earned the epithet Pedro the Just within 18 months. In his second year, he issued a warrant with 2 names on it. Pacheco was already dead, killed in Castile under circumstances the chronicles do not detail. Coelho and Gonçalves were alive, sheltering under the protection of King Pedro I of Castile. Pedro Edivian in Portugal submitted a formal extradition request. He filed it as a legal matter. He had documentation. He had jurisdictional precedent from existing diplomatic agreements between the 2 crowns. He submitted the request with the same precision he brought to his trade regulations. He waited. Castile complied. The 2 men were returned to Portugal in 1360. Pedro held a formal proceeding. The accounts differ on the length of the trial. They do not differ on the outcome. Both men were sentenced to execution. The Crónica de Pedro Temesed records that Pedro personally supervised what followed. He stood. He watched. He made no recorded comment. He had requested one specific thing regarding the aftermath. Their hearts were removed. The Chronicle presents this as his direct and personal instruction. Whether it was grief operating as justice or justice operating as something colder than grief. The 14th century had no clean vocabulary for the distinction. He was not finished. He had one more thing to build. Pedro. I spent the year 1360 in administrative visibility. His court ran. His laws held. He received ambassadors from Castile, Aragon, and England. He issued trade writs and judicial appointments with the regularity of a king fully committed to governance. Inwardly, the project had already been underway for 3 years. It required stone. It required craftsmen summoned from 3 Portuguese monasteries. It required a declaration that would pass through ecclesiastical channels and emerge on the other side as royal fact, and it inetstuin gandfrani keseder dani werdenen sounds. Required the church to accept that a retrospective legitimization of a secret marriage had canonical standing. The church had reservations. Pedro had a crown. In 1360, Pedro Temesta declared before his court, his bishops, and the papal representative in Lisbon, he and Inês de Castro had been secretly married before her death. The ceremony had taken place. She was, and had always been, the legitimate Queen of Portugal. The declaration was not a religious proceeding in any conventional sense. It was a restructuring of the official record, a takeover of the Church's authority to define matrimony, executed by a king whose grief had been running on a 5-year timeline and was now prepared to be formalized. The Church accepted it. Inês de Castro was posthumously declared Queen of Portugal. Try to inhabit that moment. The woman who had spent 15 years outside the official record, unnamed in decrees, absent from registries, invisible within the system that eventually authorized her death, was now by royal command inside it. Permanently, retroactively. The ledger had been corrected. She had been dead for 5 years. She would have been 40 years old. January 1361. Pedro ordered the exhumation. The logistics are documented in the monastery records at Alcobaça. Her remains were transported 100 kilometers north from Coimbra, in a procession that Pedro had designed with the deliberateness of a man who had been planning it for 6 years. The coffin was draped in white and gold. 40 monks preceded the cortege carrying torches. The procession moved through the Portuguese countryside at a pace that required villages along the route to present themselves at the roadside for hours. They were required to bow. They were required to witness. When she arrived at Alcobaça, the royal monastery where the Portuguese kings were interred, the burial ground of the dynasty, the preparation was already complete. A throne, a crown, a chamber arranged to the full protocol of a living queen's installation ceremony. She was robed. She was seated. The crown was placed. Pedro opened the doors. Stand inside that hall for a moment. The bishops who had negotiated the declaration, the councillors whose predecessors had drafted the warrant, the lords of Portugal, some of whom had been present when Afonso IV's council decided what would happen to Inês de Castro, some of whom had signed documents that made her invisible while she lived. They formed the line. One by one, each lord of Portugal approached the throne. One by one, they bowed. One by one, they took her hand and kissed it. In the feudal grammar of subordination and recognition, each kiss was an acknowledgement, a correction, an official reversal. There is no record of what Pedro said during the ceremony. No speech survives, no decree issued at that moment. He stood. He watched his court perform the ritual of loyalty for the woman it had helped erase. The ceremony ended. She was interred in her tomb at Alcobaça. The sarcophagus Pedro had commissioned remains, 700 years later, one of the finest examples of Gothic funerary sculpture in Europe. Angels at her head, the Passion of Christ carved along the sides, her face in stone, at rest. Pedro's tomb was placed immediately facing hers, not beside, facing, his stone face turned toward hers toward his. Portuguese tradition holds that he specified the positioning himself, so that on the day of resurrection, the first thing Pedro I would see would be Inês de Castro. He died in 1367. He was 47 years old. He had been king for 10 years. 9 of those years were the project. 1 was everything else. Inês de Castro's place in the royal record remained. She is listed in Portuguese dynastic history as Queen of Portugal, a status that has not been formally challenged in 700 years. Her children received legitimized status after the 1360 declaration. 2 died young. A third, João, became a military figure in the wars that followed. None of them took the throne. Portugal passed to Pedro's son Fernando in 1367, through a different succession line, precisely the outcome Afonso IV's council had tried to prevent. They did not prevent it. 217 years after her death, Luís Vaz de Camões placed Inês de Castro into his Lusíadas, his national epic of Portugal. He gave her 11 stanzas in Cante da Trade. He called her death the wound the kingdom could not close. The wound has not fully closed. The tombs at Alcobaça are still there. In the discourses on Livy, Machiavelli observed that a political system fears, above all, the man who has already settled the cost. A man who can be bought or threatened or outlasted presents a calculable problem. A man who has already paid and is simply waiting for the correct moment presents no solution at all. The lesson is not unique to Portugal. Dynasties across 3 continents understood it. In every system built on institutional hierarchy, the variable it cannot process is the one who has nothing left to lose. Afonso IV's council removed Inês de Castro from the ledger in 1355. Pedro, they spent 10 years correcting that entry. The system that authorized the removal did not anticipate the decade that followed it. Today, tourists move through the nave of Alcobaça Monastery in organized groups. They photograph the tombs. They read the plaques. They do not always know whose faces are turned toward each other in the stone. The kingdom gave her more in death than it ever permitted her in life. The stone holds both of them equally. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story changed how you think about grief and what it is capable of, subscribe, hit the like button, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. You have just watched another premium documentary from Velours Spectre. Click the video appearing on your screen right now. The descent into the past continues.